I just want to say a prayer, and it goes like this. Creator, we give you thanks for all you are and all you bring to us for our visit within your creation. And Jesus, you placed the gospel in the center of this sacred circle through which all of creation is related. You show us the way to live a generous and compassionate other with respect and commitment as we grow in your spirit. For you are God, now and forever. Amen. Well, I want to begin by sharing a little bit of history with you. Although I'm Mohawk and my mom is a Mohawk and I live at the Six Nations Reserve in Southern Ontario, I was actually raised on the Onondaga Nation, which is south of Syracuse, New York. And my grandma was a steadfast Episcopalian or Anglican. And in actuality, I can trace my Anglican roots way back to the early 1700s when several chiefs journeyed to England to have an audience with Queen Anne. And one of the things they asked her for was for religious instruction. And so Queen Anne responded by sending missionaries to work among our people, primarily the Mohawks and Onondagas. And in fact, she commissioned 2 silver communion sets for use of both Mohawk and Onondaga. And there's another story there, but I don't want to go into that story. So anyway, I grew up in that church. I was baptized and confirmed. So I'm what you call a cradle Episcopalian or Anglican. And during my formation at the Church of the Good Shepherd, as it was called, among the Onondagas, I sometimes it was difficult because it was something that I didn't know if I should be doing, but because of my respect and love for my aunties, one of which was my godmother and my grandma, that's the journey I took. And other folks, or my friends, were not churchgoers, so to speak. Some didn't even attend church, and some went to what's called the Longhouse, or the more traditional religion of the people. So I was at conflict at times. However, the church was at that time a focal point of the community. Everyone came to the church for this and that. They used the facilities for many things, and it was always well staffed with what's called church army. And church army is, I don't know if you heard of the church army here in Canada, but they're very instrumental in providing ministry to many of our Indigenous communities, not only in the United States, but in Canada as well. And now in Canada, they're called threshold ministries, but they're pretty much the same. And so they were vital in the community, and they lived in the community. They were able to live there at the church. They had a parsonage, they called it, or actually it was called the mission house. And so they lived right there with the people. They were not Indigenous, but they grew to love the culture and to make sure that they were not infringing on the culture, but more with the culture. So they were good in that respect. And I have to say that many missionaries who were sent to different Indigenous communities were actually very good. There were some, however, who weren't so good, and that is what sticks with people in their minds. So as the years passed, the Diocese of Central New York didn't seem to think that the mission at Good Shepherd was viable, and they began to reduce services. They did supply a priest on major holy days, and I think maybe once a month for a while. And it kept dwindling. They just kept dwindling to the point now where the church no longer is viable. The last time I went by there when I was visiting, the church is just crumbling. It's rotting away. and it's a historical landmark at that. So all of that is very painful for me to see. But there are people down there who would still appreciate in a while, you know, just to be able to have communion and to share that with each other would be really good for them. But the more they get away from it, the less want they have. In other words, they have been disposed. They are disposable. They were abandoned by the diocese, by the bishop, by whoever, by the powers that be. And so that, you know, sets heavy, it's heavy in my heart. I tried to work out a deal where I would go maybe once a month to do services there, but the bishop has been reluctant to even let us do that because, well, we could not use the church for one thing, but I know that I could get use of the local Methodist church to do that. But she still was not receptive to that idea. So it's one of those things that I just had to let go because of other things that I needed to do. But who knows? You know, it may come back. I don't know. Maybe it's lost to the point where it can never return. I don't know, but it's like the phoenix bird. You know what happened to the phoenix bird? You know, it did come back. So maybe that'll happen too. Now, and so I had gone away from the church for a while, trying to find out where I belonged, you know, as an Indigenous woman. And I did a lot of searching. And I actually took a little hiatus from the church for about 10 years, I guess. I was kind of exploring other options to fulfill my spirituality as an Indigenous woman. But then what happened was my grandma died, and my grandfather, who was a very, very devout traditional person, he knew all of the ceremonies, the songs and dances, and was a spiritual leader, not only for the community, but for me as well. And so after she died, he called me up and said, come on up, I want to talk to you. So I did. And what he told me was that I needed to go back to the church. He says, that's what you know best. And Ma would really want you to do that. And then he said, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where you go, as long as you give thanks to God, our creator, and are kind and respectful, you know. And he named off all these traits that are not only traditional values, but are also Christian values. So I thought about it a bit, and I said, okay, I'll go back. And so I did, and I didn't know what to expect, but the people were just so happy that I came back. And the first thing they did was they asked me to go to a meeting in Oklahoma, a gathering of Indigenous Episcopalians from across the United States. And so I went not knowing what to expect and not even thinking that there were other Indigenous Episcopalians in the United States. I was really quite surprised by that. And that was a real life-changing experience because I began to see that what the people were talking about was self-determination and making a way for them in the church to be effective leaders, to really take charge of the ministry. And that really appealed to me. Although it did not appeal to everyone at the time. This was back in 1986. So that was my first involvement. And then since that time, I was involved in many other national gatherings and many other councils of the church that dealt with Indigenous ministry. And I was sitting in my office one day. I was an executive director of an urban Indian center in Syracuse, New York. And I received a call from the person who was the staff officer for Indigenous Ministries at the time. And she says, I have something I want you to do. And I said, well, okay, what is it? And she said, now you're the only person that can do this. And I said, what is it? And she says, well, they're really trying to recruit Indigenous people to be missionaries. And they're offering an 8-week mission exposure program. And they really want an Indigenous person to do it. And I think you're the only person that can do it with the job you have and the flexibility you have. So I said, well, okay. I mean, it was always my dream to go to Alaska. And I said, why not? So I went to Alaska for 8 weeks and served in a couple of villages. And my reason or my purpose for being there was to identify potential lay leaders in the church, and then to talk to them about what kind of training they would need in order to do services. And I must tell you that that wasn't my first trip to Alaska. I actually went the year before on an evangelism trip with Bishop Mark McDonald and some others from the Episcopal Church, and we visited a number of villages along the Yukon River, and these were all Indigenous villages. And we were just amazed. We were amazed with the land and the people. And we were also amazed that many had not had a church service in 2 or 3 years. We were the first Episcopal presence that they had had for all those years. But yet, the people were there. They were still faithful to the church. And so we sang and we did prayers and did Holy Communion for the people. And that too was quite an experience, because just to see the faces of the people as they received communion was, so awesome. And you could just see their faces glowing in our little churches, log churches along the Yukon River. And so that, I just had to back up a little bit to tell you that. So then when I went for my 8-week mission, I was still, very skeptical about what I could do, because I didn't know the culture of the Athabascans. And although we're all Indigenous people, we do have our differences. So I had to do some learning and listening and visiting, and really worked hard to develop relationships with the people there. I even learned to drink tea. I don't like tea, but I learned to drink it because that was key in getting to know the people. And then I had to eat their food. I do not like salmon, but I learned to love salmon, and moose meat and all kinds of different foods that they harvest from the land. And it was good. It turned out really good. And I was somewhat surprised at how good it turned out. And I want to tell you one little story about my time, about my 8-week mission. There was an elder lay reader who would look in on us and make sure we had everything. And I say we because they flew in a team from the Lutheran Association of Missionary and Pilots to do a vacation Bible school. And they asked me to be part of that team, and I said, sure. So one day he came, and I knew who he was because we had talked the whole time I was there. And so he came by and he said, okay, I have something for you. And he pulled out this fish, a big salmon. I said, oh. He said, yeah, cook it up for everyone. I had never cooked salmon before in my life, so I didn't quite know what to do. So I went in and put it on the table, and the folks said, looked at it, and they just kind of rolled their eyes and didn't know what to think of it. And so I put it in the refrigerator and visit my friend that I had made, and to ask her, how do I cook this salmon? And so she told me, and so I said, okay. So then it came to be around dinner time, and I took the salmon out. And I remember so distinctly this one woman looking at it as I put it on the kitchen, ready to make fillets and to get it ready for cooking. And she said, are we really going to eat that salmon? No, fish. She didn't call it salmon, she called it fish. I said, yes, we are, and we're going to like it. So I proceeded to cook it, and I can't, it must have been God's hands were helping me, because it was the best salmon that I had ever tasted. And it it was the best salmon they had ever tasted because nothing was left. They ate the whole thing. Sometimes we are preconceived in our notions about what people like, but I think that the early missionaries there were actually quite good because they really tried to live with the people, and I think that's really important. But in having said all that, we have to look at why people went without, why they were disposed, why they were abandoned. And when you look at it, it all comes down to money. Because at one time, just about every village, and there are 29 villages in Alaska that had an Episcopal church, and each one of those churches had a priest or clergy that worked with them, that lived with them, and they were all paid, fully paid, and they were paid by the national church to do that. But then, you know, as money started to get tight, they started to look at, well, what can we get rid of, or how can we cut the budget? And so that was one of the first things to go. And I have to say that some of those churches never recovered from that, and some still go forth with lay leadership. And in those places, it's because of what bishops like Mark MacDonald did. They really inspired and encouraged lay people to do the ministry. And he sent people like me and other folks out to do the training, to equip the people to do that kind of work. So places like that that we were able to reach and do a good job, they are still effective, and they are still doing the ministry with the people. But like I said, there are some that will probably never ever recover. And then, so now let's look at Canada. Well, what happened in Canada is pretty much the same thing. There were many places where missionaries went, and missionaries did this and missionaries did that. And I think one of the most famous missionaries is Robert MacDonald, way back in the mid-1800s, who served with the Gwich'in in Canada and in Alaska as well. Well, they didn't know Alaska wasn't Canada at the time. So he actually set up shop in Fort Yukon, which is part of Alaska. But the work he did is kind of hallmark, because what he did was he, again, lived with the people, learned to eat the food, and he translated the Book of Common Prayer and the Bible into the language of the people, which was Dago. And those books are now instrumental in helping people preserve the language. So there were other missionaries like him. And I believe the first missionary, Indigenous missionaries, were Henry Budd and James Settee in northern Manitoba, and they also did good work too. But what happened? Well, same thing. The money dried up. They could not support the missionaries, and so the missionaries left. And some places were left without folks to carry on the ministry. Some places it survived and survived well, but there are still some who are in need of the sacraments. And it's one of those things, you know, we call ourselves a sacramental church, and that we believe in the baptism and the Holy Communion. Those are the two prime sacraments that we really believe in and we want people to have and share in, but we can't provide that. And as I look at folks in some of our communities in Canada, there are some again who have not had communion in a couple of years because lack of clergy. But we're trying to do something about that. We're trying to negotiate with bishops and other folks to have a lay communion. And we know we're kind of have to bend some rules, but what else are we going to do? The people crave for it. The people yearn for communion. And right now we are having a lay ministry class online. It's virtual, and we are trying to equip our folks with different pastoral training, and also equipping people to do communion if it's going to be allowed. So it's been tough for many of our communities. And even I myself, when I first went to Alaska, I was used to having communion every week, and I needed to have that communion every week. I understood what it was. As a young person, I didn't understand it. And I'll tell you another little funny story. Way back, I remember sitting in our church at the Good Shepherd, and the communion was so sacred and so respected that you weren't supposed to look at it. You weren't supposed to watch the priest as he consecrated the elements. You were supposed to sit there with your head bowed and your eyes down. Well, being the curious child I was, I just lifted my head to look up. Well, my auntie slapped me in the back of the head and told me to put my head down and don't look up there. So that's what I had to do. But anyways, as I grew to really understand the communion and its spiritual wealth for me, I knew that it was something that I needed to do, every week if I could. So when I went to Alaska, I went for about, maybe 2 months without communion because it just wasn't available. And we didn't have a priest to come and do it. And it's really sad because in some of our communities, our young people associate death with a communion, because the one time they tried to really put priests in those communities was when someone died, so that they could do the service. And that was the time that they did communion. And so I remember when someone died in the village I was serving in, someone had died, and I was walking around trying to figure out the service and, get things in order for the priest who was coming in. And the priest, a couple of young people were walking with me, and they looked at me and they said, "Who died?" When they saw the priest, they immediately thought, well, who died? And they didn't know. And I said, so I said, so-and-so died. And they said, oh, yeah, they only come when people die. And that is sad. So are they disposable? Well, it seems to me that many of our communities have been disposed. They've been abandoned. And is there hope? Yes, there's a lot of hope, because we still have lay people who are willing to take on the ministry and do the ministry with the people that needs to be done. And that's what we're focused on right now, is training people, to equip them to carry forth and to give them the encouragement that they need to do the service that God is calling them to do. And who knows, we may be able to ordain some people out of that lot. I don't know, but I think it starts there. And that's, and that's another issue within our communities, is that the majority of our priests are non-stipendiary, meaning that they have to have other kind of work, or that they're retired and can live on a pension, so they don't have to be, so they're not paid. And that too is a travesty of sorts, because if you look at other communities in Canada, particularly urban areas, the priests are paid well. They get a pension, they get health benefits, and all the other good stuff. But our clergy do not. Most of our clergy do not. And, and sometimes I feel a bit privileged, because I'm one of those priests that has been paid. And right now I'm partly retired. And, and I collect a pension, which is good, and I collect my work from pay, and so I'm in good shape. But there are many who are not. And sometimes, and so what I end up doing is I end up giving away a lot of my money to people who need it to support them. It's just what I'm called to do. So there's lots that I think can be done to make our folks feel less dispossessed, less disposed of. But it's going to take work. It's going to take partners and allies in our communities to do that. But I think a lot of people don't know exactly what goes on in Indigenous ministry and how difficult it is and the challenges that we have. And I think once people see the challenges and understand them, they'll be more readily and able to help, to assist in getting things done. When I think back to my Alaska days, I think, whoa, I really did that. Because now I know I couldn't do all that, because I'm older and because of some bouts I've had in the hospital, I could not do, and I did. I mean, I had to haul my own water and chop my own wood. And I remember the elder layperson, we had a real cold spell. It was about 70 below every day for over a week. And every day he would walk down to my little trailer. And I lived in this little trailer, not the best insulated place to live, but that was all that was available. And he would walk in and I'd have a pot of coffee on, and he'd come in and he'd look at me and he said, "You're still alive." And I say, "Yes, but by the grace of God, I'm still alive." So those kinds of challenges are still out there. There are still people who have to build their own fires and who have to figure out how to live on the land.
We lost you, Ginny, but you may be back. You may have to repeat a little bit of what you just said. You're not back yet.
But that's where they were a minute.
No, we've now lost you almost completely. You might consider turning off your video and see if that helps. But you need to back up to the trailer piece. Actually, we've lost her completely. Sorry, everybody. It appears that she has disappeared for the moment. Let's hold on for a minute. I know the idea of living in a trailer at -70 below sounds pretty challenging. Yeah, I think you would agree with that. I'm also quite interested in, she's referenced it twice, about how it's important to eat the food. That is to say, to become part of or mesh with the society in which you are. I thought that was a really good story about the salmon, for instance, and I can well imagine her pleasure at being able to have the salmon cooked that was that well received. Certainly want to chew on the lay presider business. I can see some priests in the gallery who will have some comments, I suspect, on that if the opportunity presents itself. Because lay presidership is a pretty radical position to be taking. Certainly for some of us Southerners. Nope, she's not back yet. Okay, if anybody would like to jump in, unmute themselves and make a comment, you are welcome to right now. When she comes back, we'll go back to mute it again to listen, okay? So, oh, wait a minute, she's here. You're back.
I'm here.
You're back, okay. We disconnected partway through the story about the trailer at -70 and the coffee, and you're still here. And then you
Yeah,
weren't.
I'm still here.
And then
No,
you weren't
that's
there. Yeah.
that's pretty much the story. He would just come and check on me to make sure I was still alive, and
Okay.
yeah, that's the story. So, are there questions?
Where did you go from there? Because you had more to say as you disappeared from us.
No, well, what I was saying was that those are the challenges that we face as we could work with our people. Even people who have lived in those communities for many years are still challenged by keeping the heat, keeping warm, because things are so expensive in our communities that they still have to, depend on different forms of heat. Not everyone has the luxury of having a furnace, and some still have to burn wood in order to keep it warm. So that's all I wanted to say. Was the challenges are still there.
We'll open it up in a minute, but I started talking about the key stories that you told twice about drinking tea, salmon, and moose meat, and in fact, getting to know and being with people that you were traveling with. I thought that was key.
Yes, I think that's very vital in any kind of mission work that anyone undertakes. For us, it's about building relationships first, and not about just diving in and saying, I'm going to teach you how to read the Bible, or I'm going to teach you Bible stories. It's, build a relationship first. And I think you'll find it'll make your mission a lot easier if you do that first. You have to build that trust, and when you think about it, we try to live by what are called our 7 traditional teachings, and one of them is trust, honesty, respect, love, wisdom, bravery, or courage. And in those teachings, we have to remember them as we go forth our ministry. And they are not against Christian values. They're the same. They're the same values that Jesus had, and the same values that Jesus wants us to have. So that's what I think made Christianity so acceptable to many of our people, was that they could see that those traditions were still there. A different way, perhaps, of giving thanks and of being in worship and praise, but they were still there, and that's what people were looking for.
I see Margaret has unmuted. Margaret?
I wanted to make some comments about what I know about the Arctic Church. I work there, and I think generally speaking, Arctic missionaries did a pretty good job, of living with the people. Well, you really can't go anywhere else when you're there. And I sure ate a lot of strange things at my ordination. But it's happens that they are also short of people, and they are ordaining a lot of their own people among the Inuit, which is great. And I think I was wondering at the time I left that, maybe that's the way it should go. But like Ginny says, it's all about money. These people are not being paid really anything like we are in the South, and it's a lot more expensive to live up there. And as I made in an earlier comment here, when I had come south, I had hoped to work in Northwestern Ontario at one point with Indigenous, but they just didn't have the money to hire anyone. I think the whole diocese at that time only had about 2 fully paid people. So it really is an issue about money.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's an issue. I mean, the Arctic is is probably more progressive than any other diocese that I can see that does Indigenous ministry. You know, right now they have 3 Indigenous bishops, which is kind of astounding and something that people thought would never ever happen. But they have 3 Indigenous paid bishops. And much of the money for the Arctic comes from the Council of the North, comes from national grant money. And however, that, you know, that is dwindling as well. So they're going to have to make a plan of sustainability. And I think they're doing that. They're looking at ways to raise funds to support the mission and ministry of the Arctic. And it's vital because they are probably the most, have the most Anglicans, I would think. I mean, even these little communities have Anglican missions or services. And again, most of them led by non-paid clergy. And they have been pretty good about ordaining clergy as
Oh dear. Well, she was back once. She will be back again. Well. Oh, here we go. Lost you for a little.
I think more so than in. Are you there?
We're here. We lost you for a little bit.
Okay.
Ginny, do you want to try turning off your video and just do voice? See if that cuts down the bandwidth problem. Okay, she's.
I just had one more comment to make.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, she's totally gone at the moment now. So
she talked about the 3 Inuit bishops, and the first one, who was an Inuit bishop, actually ordained me, and all the people who laid their hands on my head were Inuit clergy. So I think I may have been the first person ordained entirely by Inuit.
Other comments from people? Oh, she's back. We see you, but you're muted. You are muted, no sound.
Sorry about that.
Oh, okay.
Not at all. If this happens again, do you want,
down again?
Yep. Do you want to try no video or turning your video off if this happens again, just to see if that will do it? Because then we've got your voice.
Yeah, I can do that right now. Maybe that'll help.
Okay. Don't disappear though. Stay here.
No.
There. Okay. Are you here? You're here orally? Okay, good.
Yes. Yes, I'm here.
Perfect. Okay. Other comments from people? Dana, go.
So I was really resonating when Ginny was talking about people being abandoned and not being able to, and losing the ability to worship in the same way. I spent 2 summers in the Diocese of Moosonee in the parish of Geraldton before I was ordained. And one of the things I did was I went to a place called Collins, which was a little community on the railway. And they'd had a wonderful little church there, but somewhere, I don't know, maybe 10 years earlier, they had lay leadership. The two of the Indigenous elders had been leading worship. And then all of a sudden, the key was taken for the church and the vestry book was removed. And there was a sense that because the clergy were the most important, if they couldn't be there, then the church shouldn't be open. And I went back 10 years later to do morning prayer with them, and they struggled even to remember what that was like, because it had been left, they had lost the practice of it because the church had been closed to them. And so when Ginny was talking about it, it reminded me again of that story and the sadness I felt leading worship with people who had been leading it themselves less than 10 years earlier, and now we're struggling with it. And that's part of the reason I have a passion for it now. But I just want to say I really resonated with that sense of abandonment and what it can do.
Yes, unfortunately, that has happened other places as well, where the powers that be decide that the mission is not viable. And who gives them the right to do that, I'm not sure. But I think every time there are 2 or 3 gathered, the mission is viable. And people don't realize that. And yes, they may not be giving money to support the diocese. And I've heard that some places have closed because they're not paying their money to the diocese. And I think that borders on criminal, because as Jesus said, you know, when 2 or 3 are gathered, I'm there in the midst. And it just baffles me sometimes how our church has moved to more money driven and focused than mission. And you can do mission with, you know, so little. I mean, when I think about, you know, what I did in Alaska was so little, it really makes me kind of odd. I was odd by myself because what it helped me do was to remember my creativity, and it inspired my creativity to come up with projects for the young kids so that they could begin to know Jesus. And so that time was critical for me because it really made me creative, and therefore I could help other people be creative as well. I mean, some of the things those kids did with so little was just amazing. And I mean, we did things, and people do it now, but back then it was new to them, like painting on rocks, you know, because there's all kinds of rocks there, and they would paint on rocks and send little messages of a word that meant a lot to them. You know, a lot of it was love, a lot of it was hope, you know, good messages, and then they would give them out to people. So there are things that can be done, I think, so that our communities can continue to worship together. But, you know, if you're closed, you're closed. It's one of those things that happen. And again, it's really instilling our people to reclaim their purpose and their self-determination. I mean, how can someone tell a community in an Indigenous village that they can't have a church? They should not be able to do that because it's their church. It's not the bishop's church. It's not the vestry's church. It's the people's church. But people don't understand that anymore.
Joe Connolly, you had some comments. Would you like to speak more?
Oh, sure. This is, I mean, such an important conversation. Ginny and Margaret and Vanessa and Vivian, I think, you know, Ginny, your words to us really strike at our heart about, you know, what can we do to advocate and add our voices to these communities that need support and need to know that their ministry is important, and that we send our not just our love, but somehow be able to send resources. It's been hard, but very important to hear your words today.
Well, I think in terms of resources, there's something that could be done. And way back in 1999, I had spent some time at the Episcopal Church's national office as the interim officer for Indigenous ministry. And during that time, I got to know a number of young people because we were planning national event for youth. And so I had this committee that I worked with of young people. And not too long after the event, one of them called me up and said, I want to do something meaningful in the church. What can I do? And I said, let me think about that. And so I thought about it, and I thought, well, maybe what I can put together is a mission exposure program for young people, for young adults. And because I knew Alaska well, I picked Alaska, and I got some grant money out of the church in order to do it. And so I'm talking about people resources. And they took it on. We had a multicultural team of young people come to Alaska. We had an Asian young woman, we had Indigenous woman, we had a white guy too, and so it was a diverse group. But to see them bond and to come together was incredible. And the way we did it was they put the gospel in the center of the circle. Every day they would engage the gospel to see what the gospel was calling them to do. And we also provided them with some training, because our goal was to send them out into several villages to work with young people. Because during the summer, and this is the summer month, it's very difficult for our young people because they have so much time on their hand, and it's 24 hours of light. So we equipped them before we sent them out, but they did such a fantastic job. And to this day, they are still in touch with each other. They develop those relationships with the people, with the young people in those villages. They still have contact with them. And it's something that really worked. And it was all about people. And yes, we had some money to do it, but we didn't pay them to do it. They came and they learned, and it's an experience they'll never, ever forget. And it's an experience that really helped them in achieving their life goals, because every one of those young people who was involved is in a meaningful, productive job. And I can't say more about that kind of opportunity, but we're not providing those opportunities as a church. And we could. I mean, why couldn't we send a mission team to Kingfisher to do kind of the same thing, or to see to do what is needed, to help do what is needed? You know, why couldn't we send one to the Arctic? Why couldn't we send one out to BC to work with the Siksika or the Kenai? You know, there's so many opportunities there for mission work. We're just not doing it. End of sermon.
I have Beth next, and then Gail, and then Doug. Okay, and we'll keep going as long as we can. Beth next, then Gail, then Doug.
Yes, thank you. I have a question about Anglican polity, and tell me if I'm understanding this correctly, but it sounds like, well, I'll put it in a positive. Couldn't lay people be trained and consecrated to give Holy Communion, or does that happen?
It happens on a sly.
Okay.
Again, it's all about the bishop. If the bishop says okay, then it's okay. The way I see it. Now, for example, Mark McDonald, when he was in Alaska, he would consecrate bread and wine and send people out on high holy days to give communion. I mean, I did communion when I was a lay person in several villages because Mark said I could. And the thing with that, it gets tricky because the people might think they're being fooled, but I always told them we are using bread and wine that has been blessed by the bishop or blessed by whatever priest, so that it made it more bona fide to them. And, you know, I always said I've been given permission to do this. It was a bending of the canon, or not the canon, but the rubric that says you send the communion out as soon as possible to shut-ins, and we were looking at our village people as being shut-ins.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. It gives some
Okay.
hope.
Gail, Doug, and then Vanessa. Gail? Hi, Gail, you gotta unmute. Gail, are you coming in? If not,
There, am I now?
You are here now. Go for it.
Sorry, it wasn't working. No, I just wanted to mention what I already sent in a message, that Archbishop MacDonald has a fund which he uses for non-stipendiary ministry in the Anglican Indigenous Church. And just as an anecdote, I lived in Armstrong for a couple of years, which is Northern Ontario, north of Thunder Bay. There was a priest named Canon Long who lived in Nakina, and he would travel starting on Sunday morning. He would come through Armstrong, Collins, Savant Lake, and end up in Sioux Lookout and hold services in each one of those communities. And I think he was at least late 80s, a really wonderful man.
Thank you. Doug, do you want to make a comment? Derek, you're next after Doug.
Okay, as I say, I've been to a couple of Indigenous conferences over the last few years, and the same as what I heard here in the presentation, there is a lot of talk of communities in the far north in Canada that are desperately in need of leadership and guidance, that are interested in learning about a Christian life and supporting the church. I was at one conference where they actually said there were churches up north that were booming, that people were anxious to go to, but as we heard today, because of money, they pull out the support for them and they close them down and simply abandon these people. And it just doesn't seem right that the churches, the diocese, no, I'm not saying just this diocese, but all the dioceses together, that they can't get together and form some kind of a fund that helps support the growing churches and support the people in their development there, that they worship the way that they see, and it's meaningful to them, and they should be encouraged to do so. That was really all I wanted to say.
Yes, and let me respond to that. We are working on a number of funding strategies that we can support our churches better. But it's like anything else. It takes the time, and this pandemic has slowed some of that, because we are redirecting money to what we're calling the pandemic response. We feel it's vitally important that we nurture the spirituality of our people at this time for their well-being. So it is something that we are working on, and we do have, we have received donations from time to time from people for non-stipendiary priests, and we have given that money out, and it's so much appreciated. It's not a lot. I think the last round we gave like $200 to every non-stipendiary priest, but they certainly appreciated it. And so we're going to continue and see what else we can do. It's one of those things that is, it tears at your heart, but it's like, that old saying, you can't get blood out of a stone. And that's what it feels like sometimes. And we have two Indigenous bishops who are struggling right now because they're not paid well. And it goes from month to month, how are we going to pay them? And, I've written grants for them and done all kinds of things to try to help, but we really need a plan that's going to work well into the future. And it seems like we spend so much time in crisis mode that it's difficult to really sit down and plan and work towards that plan, because something always seems to come up where, oh, we got to take care of this first, and then we can get back to raising money for our non-stipendiary.
Thank you, Derek. Then Vanessa and Dave, and then Vivian, okay? So Derek, Vanessa, Dave, Vivian. Derek? Derek, you're muted. There you go.
Yes, I'm very grateful for Jenny's testimony that people are in need and people do respond to the church's ministry. After over 50 years in ministry, I've come to believe in the ministry of the laity. And if you only, in our hierarchical system, we give back the church to the Holy Spirit. It's the Holy Spirit that empowers us for ministry. And it's time we recognize that. And so then acknowledge that as a person is baptized in Christ, empowered by the Holy Spirit, and as Jesus promised, is the Spirit who is going to teach us. I believe that our ministry could be more dynamic. But our hierarchical system needs to understand that and have a sense of partnership in ministry. The church has a tremendous resource in the laity, who are just as educated as the clergy, and who have gifts, as we heard this morning from 1 Corinthians chapter 12. We have gifts, and the church can be alive, but only in the power of the Holy Spirit. That's my testimony.
Amen to that. You know, because I was considered a lay leader for a long time, I can relate to that. And I'll have to tell you this, in coming to Canada, one of the things I realized is that there wasn't a high value on lay ministry like there is in the United States. When in the Episcopal Church's catechism, when they talk about who are the ministers of the church, the first ones named are the lay ministers. But in the Canadian Church, in the Book of Common Prayer, the lay people are pretty much excluded. And I think that's where it has to change, because many of our people don't see themselves as ministers, lay ministers, because that's something that you have to be ordained to be, and you have to be a priest or clergy in order to be a minister. But I believe that we're all called to be a minister of some kind, whether it be a minister of taking care of the shut-ins or taking communion to people, whatever that ministry is, there it's needed. And we just really need to change that whole mindset about the value of lay ministry. You know, I'm 100% behind that. And I've really struggled with it since being in Canada, because it's really hard to have our lay people take it on, because they don't feel that they're worthy, because they're not ordained, and it goes on and on and on.
Absolutely.
And I don't have to tell you any more about it.
Yeah.
Vanessa, you're next.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Thank you very much, Ginny, for facilitating this wonderful discussion, although it's very painful to hear as a layperson in the Diocese of Toronto. I hear exactly what you're saying, and I have great concern. And even though I support the Indigenous peoples through my little funding that I may send to the Anglican Church of Canada, my concern is how can we change the value and the model at the primacy level to get the primate to look at this issue and to see how she can be more supportive. I mean, I'm not getting into any of the politics or anything, but just on, we need to be able to build up the body of the church pastorally, but we also have to do this in a practical way by providing the funds. And perhaps you have some ideas on how you can approach the primate. I can't do it. I could write a letter, but the weight needs to come from higher up. And God bless you and your efforts in being able to facilitate this vision for our Indigenous people, which is so needed.
Well, thank you. Let me first say that our primate has been very supportive so far, as she is fairly new to the position. And with any primate, it takes a little bit of time to break them in, as we say, because I remember, or I've heard stories of Fred Hiltz, and at the beginning he wasn't, he wasn't on board either, and it took some time to help him see the value of Indigenous ministry, and that's what it's about, seeing the value of Indigenous ministry and why it's important. We're stewards of the land. We should all be stewards of the land. And that is something that we probably do maybe better than others. I'm not sure. But I think that it's coming, it's coming. But it's like anything else, good things sometimes take time. And so I'm not discouraged, and no one is giving up, and we are going to go forth and do what we can to make sure that the gospel is heard in all of our communities, and that communion is given in all of our communities. That's our goal. And with the grace of God, we'll get there. I have a lot of hope, and I thank you for your commitment to supporting Indigenous ministry.
You have my profound prayers each day, that God will guide us through this pathway to the New Jerusalem now for our Indigenous peoples.
Vanessa,
thank you.
Vanessa, you had another important point on a slightly different perspective to share. You shared it in the chat at 1:52. Do you want to talk about it again?
Remind me, please.
Gospel, about sharing the gospel.
Okay, let me just go through.
Okay. It had to do with watching the gospel on mission on YouTube.
Oh, right. Okay, got it in one. Yeah. I'm encouraging everyone to Archbishop MacDonald has a wonderful YouTube presentation on the gathering by the river, and it is absolutely wonderful. And I encourage everyone to tune into that when the platform appears either on Facebook or YouTube. It's I've watched 2 sessions before, and it's just wonderful.
Well, thank you for that. We are planning a 5th one that will be held on November 29th, I believe, at 8 p.m. Toronto time. These gospel jamborees are part of our pandemic response. And we've been able to get a lot of support from our colleagues at Church House to help put this on. It's a major effort, takes a lot of time, but it reaches many, many communities, because we not only put it on YouTube or on our website, but it goes out to many communities by radio because our communities don't have good internet. So that's one of the things we're doing. And we're gearing up for the 5th one. And if any of you want to contribute a good song, it's the theme is going to be hope and light. There's something else, but it's hope and light. So if any of you have good songs about hope and light, submit them. gospeljam.ca.
It doesn't look like it's hard to do. It looks like it comes across really smoothly and easily, but that's usually the case, isn't it, in something that's actually hard to do behind the scenes. There you go.
Yes, exactly.
I've got Dave, Vivian, and then Mary Lou. Dave, you're next.
We have to take it one church at a time, because as Jenny says, you have to build trust. In the Yukon, Bishop Larry, who's now retired, he started the Ministry of Presence with licensed lay leaders running congregations. And that's been a boon to the Indigenous communities, because most of these communities are off the main highway system and have to be supported locally. It's patience, and you make a connection, and then you follow it up with respect and love, and it blooms. But it's not easy, and once you start, you can't stop. You have to keep on supporting that community.
Yes, I've seen that in action, and it's certainly much needed, and it's also well received by people. I've seen so many places where it's just important to get together on a Sunday to do a service, and you don't always have to have communion, but I think to get together to share the gospel and to share prayers is important. And so that ministry of presence is I think, it's a good way to go. And we're trying to encourage more communities to do that through our lay ministry training program.
Dave, you talked about in the chat, you talked about twinning and exchange programs. Can you say a little bit more about that before we go on?
Yes. I was a commander of a radar site in Northern Ontario, and my neighbors were the Ojibwe from Constant Lake First Nation. So once I made an agreement through Bishop Lawrence that the Anglican priest would be the priest to the radar station, because a station is not sufficiently large to have a padre. And so we had the services of an Anglican priest for 1.5 days a week. But once, the Cold War was over, the radar stations were changed, and so we went back to moose pastures. I still kept the relationship with that First Nation and that community. And so we were able to cover their stipend to the Diocese of Moosonee, so they were never had to worry about stipend. Their donations ran the church.
Good, thank you. Vivian, and then Mary Lou.
Sort of a governance question. Now that there's an Anglican Indigenous circle within the Anglican Church of Canada, where do decisions about churches opening and closing in the north get made? Is that
that still rests with the diocesan bishop. We haven't yet worked out our constitution. We're working on it now, but hopefully when that is approved and what have you, our Archbishop Mark will be given much of that authority. But that again is something that needs to be negotiated with each diocesan bishop, because right now that's where it rests. But hopefully through this negotiation, they'll work together in doing that. So that's something that we really can't change right now. It's up to the diocesan or diocesan council, whoever. But we can be advocates, and I think that's where we are right now, is trying to advocate for our churches. Fortunately, we haven't heard of any churches closing recently. Well, of course, during the pandemic, it's there's other things on people's minds than closing a church. But thank you. That's an important question, and one we're dealing with.
Mary Lou. Mary Lou, you're muted.
There I am. So my question was to Ginny. How do you foresee increasing awareness of the need re stipends for Indigenous church leaders? So how can you see would be the best way to increase awareness of that need? Certainly this participation in this has increased my awareness, but not everybody's on this call. And I'm just wondering, do you have an opinion on how you think it should be promoted in the church, either in the structure of the church or among the parishes, or what do you think would work with your knowledge of your communities and so on?
Well, I think there's 3 things that can be done. One is we have had articles printed by the Anglican Journal concerning non-stipendiary, and I think we probably need to do more of those. I think that personal stories are most effective of a non-stipendiary working in the community and about the challenges they face would be compelling. So that's one thing we can do to increase awareness. Another thing is we've been doing podcasts called Sacred Teachings. And right now we're into our, I think 5th season. And each season has a number of podcasts in it. And our theme for this one is stolen. Things that were stolen from our people. And they're quite riveting and quite compelling. I don't know if you've been able to tune into them. But we're thinking about doing a series on our non-stipendiaries as part of that. And so that's another way we can increase awareness. And a lot of it has to do with how they're promoted. We haven't been real good at promoting them, and I recognize that the last season. So I'm now making an attempt to better promote it. And then the third thing I think we can do is to be better advocates for non-stipes, and perhaps look at ways we can do fundraising for sustainability. And that's something, we're still looking at. We just need to rev it up a bit, I think. So
thank you.
There is much more to say. There is much more to learn. There are many places that all of us need to go to grow and to learn. Thank you, Ginny, so much for this afternoon, for helping us along the road to that. I urge you now to head out for the closing session, and I've sent you the link. Thank you. Go in peace, loving and serving the Holy One. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. Thank you.
And
Thanks for coordinating.
Sorry for the bad internet.
No, it worked.
Okay.
Thanks
You all take care.
Ken.
Stay safe.